"Shut up!" Daniel roared, swinging the shovel from the garage and bringing it down heavy on my arm. The sound was a hard, ringing crack, metal on bone and concrete, one bright, brutal note that seemed to hang in the cold air. Winter seeped through the warped door, carrying the smell of ice and exhaust. The bare bulb above us hummed and flickered, pouring a tired yellow over the workbench, the oil-streaked floor, the dented toolbox I'd owned for 40 years. My fingers went dead first. Then heat, sharp and staining, rushed up my forearm as if someone had poured boiling water under my skin. I tasted iron. I tried to pull back, but my boots slid on a smear of snow I'd tracked in earlier, and the shovel's blade clanged against the slab once more, a savage echo I knew I would hear again in my sleep. I hadn't even stood between him and the door. I'd said what fathers say when the bill on the counter is due, and the lights have flickered twice this week. "You've got to help with the utilities this month, son. Gas and electric. Just your share." The words were simple, even soft. He took them like an insult. He had been living on my couch since autumn, leaving dishes in the sink, charging his phone off my last open outlet. He didn't look at the bill. He looked at me as if I were the thing in the room that needed removing. Crambled time. One instant I saw the edge of the blade, mud-browned, a crust of ice on its lip. And the next the world narrowed into pain, so bright it pushed the light bulb into the corner of my eye. I heard myself grunt. It wasn't a cry, not really. It was the sound a beam makes when it takes too much weight. "Overreacting as always," Linda said from the doorway, voice flat, amusement warming it like a hand over a weak flame. She had come in from the kitchen, rubbing her arms against the draft. Her slippers made a soft, impatient scuff on the concrete. She didn't ask if I was hurt. She didn't ask why our son was holding a shovel inside the house. I cradled my forearm against my chest and tried to straighten. My palm pulsed, each throb a hammer finding the same nail. The room tipped. Sawdust dusted the bench like frost. The pegboard held my old chisels in neat rows, names I had scratched in with a nail so I'd remember which came from which job. The smallest chisel had built 2 cradles. The mallet had tamped home 100 joints. Work that had taken me years to understand had always begun here, on this rough floor, under this exact light. I knew the sound of wood taking shape. I knew the feel when a joint set true. I knew when something was broken beyond glue. "Cry or what rent, Daniel?" I said, voice steadier than I expected, though the words came in pieces. "Just a little. You're 35. It's time." He stepped closer, the shovel's shaft tight in his grip, the blade quivering with leftover motion. A smear of snow melted and ran along the edge, dripping onto the floor in 3 perfect taps. His breath fogged and disappeared. "You don't tell me what to do," he said. The shovel rose as if the weight were nothing. He had my shoulders, my dark hair gone wilder. But his eyes weren't mine. They were glassy and cold, like lake ice where the current runs under. "Don't," I said, and lifted my free hand, not to stop him, only to ask for a second of air. The shaft blurred. Pain struck again, not the same, never quite the same. This time lower, a screaming pressure that buckled my knees. I staggered sideways, caught the workbench with my hip, and a line of clamps rattled like chimes. The shovel hit the floor, blade ringing. That ring carved itself into the moment, a clean metallic thread. I didn't know it then, but the sound would matter, the kind of sound that tells a story even when voices lie. Linda laughed. It wasn't loud. It was the small, contemptuous sound you give when someone drops his fork at a restaurant, when a stranger trips on a curb. "Theatrics," she said, and pinched her robe tighter. "Always the theatrics." I tried to breathe through my teeth and failed. Heat, then sweat, then a cold that started in my spine. The skin along my forearm swelled under my sleeve, tight as a drumhead. I looked at Daniel. He was panting lightly, chest rising as if he just shoveled a path through a drift. The shovel hung from his hand in a lazy angle, the blade leaving a wet crescent on the concrete. "This is our home," I said, the words thin and spaced. "Not a place to swing metal." "Your home," he said, and the pronoun was a poison. "Until you can't keep up." He jerked his head toward the kitchen. He slipped, he tossed to his mother, already rehearsing it. He always slips. The smell of oil thickened. My heart thudded in my throat. I pressed the heel of my good hand into the workbench and pushed. My legs did not like it. I rose anyway, inch by inch, the way you lift a heavy board alone, careful, slow, under the weight of your own caution. The shovel's blade flashed in the bulb's tired light like a fish turning in dark water. I thought of my father's rules. Put the tools away after use. Never leave blades wet. Never point steel at your own blood. He taught me to respect edges. He never pictured this. Enough, I said. But it wasn't to Daniel anymore. I said it to the clamor in my ribs, to the dizziness sweeping the wall toward me. I let the breath out between my teeth and kept the arm tight against me. I was not new to pain. Nails go through boots. Saws nip. Ladders slip on the second rung when the wind wants you down. Pain is a fact. Betrayal is a decision. Linda's mouth tugged at a corner like she was holding in a smile and had stopped trying. "We'll tell them you slipped in the garage," she said, each word even. "You track snow. You act clumsy. You make a scene, Arthur. You always have." "I asked for help with bills," I said. "That was the scene." Daniel sniffed. Some private verdict reached. He put the shovel down with a clatter and shook his hands out as if they'd cramped from honest work. The blade slid, scraping, the same skittering note that had followed the blow. He looked over my shoulder at the door, already checking if the neighbors could see, if the night could cover what he'd done. His face relaxed into boredom, an actor dropping a mask between lines. The cold found the space under my collar. I tasted the tin of my own breath in the back of my throat. The bulb buzzed. Somewhere in the house, a pipe ticked. The bill on the counter waited. The world, indifferent, continued. My knees softened. The bench edge caught me again. The clamps rattled once more and fell quiet, as if even they had decided to watch. The good hand's knuckles whitened on the scarred wood. I felt the swelling rise, a tide under skin. The pain sharpened and settled into a throne. I knew it would be sitting there a long time. I turned my head to my son because I still believed in names and in the use of saying them. My voice was low, more breath than sound, a thing I had to push across a small, cold room that used to be mine. "What did you just do, Daniel?" No answer. "He just slipped, Doctor." "Arthur always exaggerates," Linda cut in. The room was a bright rectangle of hard light and harder surfaces. Antiseptic hung in the air, cold and sweet, and the fluorescent bars hummed like a beehive pinned to the ceiling. A nurse clipped a plastic tag to my wrist and rolled the blood pressure cuff over my sleeve. It squeezed until the numbness in my hand tingled with pins. I tried to answer the questions she read from a tablet. Name, date of birth, medications. But the words came out thin, with little rags of breath stuck to them. Pain had its own grammar. It made each syllable an uphill push. Linda stood at the foot of the gurney, arms folded, robe thrown over her nightgown, like she'd been interrupted from something important. She didn't look at my arm. She watched me. When I said, "He hit me," she smiled without showing teeth, the way you do at a child insisting the moon belongs to him. "He slipped in the garage," she said again, more gently now, as if correcting a harmless mistake. "It's icy out. He's been unsteady lately." Linda stepped in with a quick glance at the monitor and a nod to the nurse. He was younger than I expected, eyes careful, the kind that look twice before they trust a first impression. "Tell me what happened," he said, pulling a stool close. His hands were warm when he palpated along the forearm, then cool where the gel touched my skin, the wand mapping out the sore topography beneath. A noise, low, involuntary, left my mouth when he touched the place where the ache sharpened to a point. "See," Linda said softly as if confirming something they both already knew. "He makes a lot of noise." I swallowed against the metallic taste at the back of my throat. My tongue felt too big. "My son," I said, and the word caught. "Used a shovel. Twice." The sentence lay there between us, small and bald and ridiculous even to my own ears in this room that believed in measurements and scans, not in the truth you haul out of your chest with both hands. The nurse's pen stilled for a beat. Dr. Patel's eyes flicked up to mine, then to Linda. "It was an accident," Linda said, pleasant, certain. "He slipped. He's been forgetful." She tilted her head toward me like a nurse might toward a patient who can't remember the day of the week. "He doesn't want to be a bother." The cuff hissed and released. I could feel my pulse in the swelling under the splint they'd wrapped at triage, each beat a small hammer. I thought of the garage floor, the stray meltwater, the way the sound had bounced off the concrete, sharp, metallic, like a bell rung too close to the ear. You don't forget a noise like that, it sticks. I tried to arrange the memory in order, not to convince them so much as to keep myself from drifting. Dr. Patel frowned, the expression small, almost private, and turned to the computer. His fingers moved fast. On the screen, I saw the skeleton's pale double and the trouble carved into it. A clean line where there shouldn't be one. He didn't narrate the images, not yet. He returned to me, set his fingertips near but not on the worst spot, and asked, "On a scale of 1 to 10? 8, I said. 9 when I move." "Let's keep you still," he said gently, and nodded to the nurse, who began gathering materials. Gauze rasped softly. Tape whispered. The room smelled more strongly of alcohol swabs than the chalky scent of the fiberglass cast. The nurse slid a slab under my wrist, cradled the limb with practiced kindness. Every touch that wasn't cruel felt like an argument against the last hour. Linda sighed theatrically when I winced. "Honestly," she murmured, a tiny laugh escaping. "Arthur always exaggerates." The sound was light, almost bored. A little flare of amusement dropped into the antiseptic brightness. It landed harder than the shoveled steel. In that laugh was a verdict. Weak, fussy, unreliable. The kind of laugh that tells a stranger which story to believe. The nurse kept her eyes on the wrap. Dr. Patel didn't look at Linda. He kept his attention on my face, on the way I breathed. "Any numbness?" he asked. "Tingling? Can you move your fingers?" "I can," I said and showed him, the motion provoking a fresh wave of heat that rose and broke across my vision. The ceiling wavered. I held my breath, then let it out in a hiss, counting to 3 because numbers were solid and did not change their meaning depending on who said them. He asked about medications, about aspirin, about when I last ate. He asked if I'd fallen this month, this year, whether I'd had dizziness before. I could hear the audit in it. A careful, honorable attempt to keep the facts from bending under anyone's thumb. Linda answered where she could get there first, supplying the kind of details that sound helpful. The time I'd tripped on the porch last winter, the day I'd set down a mug on the counter and missed the edge. She told true things and threaded them into a lie. The nurse finished the first layer. The cast began to harden around the shape of me, like wet plaster becoming a wall. The pain steadied into something with borders. Beyond those borders, I could think. "Doctor," I said, I didn't slip. I kept my voice low so it wouldn't crack. He was angry. He used a shovel. Dr. Patel's frown deepened, not the irritated crease of a man who doesn't like being contradicted, but the line a carpenter gets when the board isn't sitting quite right, and he knows he needs to check the level again. His gaze went to my eyes, then lower, to the bruising that had begun to bloom like a slow flower beneath the skin. He nodded once, as if to himself. He typed, the keys making a dry little clatter. I watched his shoulders. I could not see what he wrote. I could imagine it. Patient states injury due to assault. Spouse reports accidental fall. 2 tracks on the same page. The facts would have to fight on paper as they had fought in the garage. "Demolish confirmed the fracture," he said finally. "We'll stabilize the arm tonight and schedule follow-up. I'm also noting concerns that need to be addressed once you're more comfortable." His tone was neutral, medical, but something had shifted. Small, like a hinge deciding to move after years of rust. Anna's laugh came again, airy and dismissive, when the nurse raised the cast to adjust the angle, and the pain made my breast stutter. "You see," she told the room, as if she were a hostess pointing out a charming quirk, "he always does this." No one answered her. The nurse taped the last edge clean and patted the back of my hand with 2 fingers, the kindest touch I'd felt all night. Dr. Patel stood, glanced at the monitor, then at the small console on the wall near the head of the bed. He reached toward it with the same steady economy he'd used on the ultrasound wand, no drama in the motion at all. Dr. Patel quietly pressed the record intake button. These hands once raised an entire house. I looked past the white bandage. The cast was still new, the resin smelling faintly of chalk and rain. Under it, my skin pulsed like a trapped bird. I held the arm against my ribs and let my gaze blur until the hospital room thinned to color and light. the window's square of winter gray, the thin curtain breathing when the vent sighed. If I didn't blink, if I let the present unspool, another room slid in, the old workshop in the back lot, long before the garage became a place for anger. Back then, the bulb over the bench burned clean and bright. In the 70s, everything I owned seemed to be made of pine and promise. I had a borrowed planer, a stack of boards from a mill 2 towns over, and a head full of measurements that felt like prayers. When you set a post true, when your level's bubble rests exactly in its glass, the world calms. I started with the foundation. Concrete poured slow and patient. Edges troweled smooth in pale morning. I remember the first stud going up, the soft thunk of my mallet seating it, the sweet, resinous breath of freshly cut lumber. A frame rose under my hands, lines I could trust, angles that held. Tabinda Linda would come by in the evenings with a thermos. She wasn't tired of me yet. Marriage was still an open window. She would perch on a sawhorse, legs in blue jeans she rolled at the cuff, and watch. Sawdust landed in her hair like gold. "You make it look easy," she'd say, and I'd grin because that was the only kind of praise I ever believed, in the small, steady sort that noticed the way a joint closed without a fight. I built her a chair on a Sunday, when it rained so hard the yard turned to soup. Oak slats, simple arms, a back that fit her shoulders. She sat in it that night in the little rental and leaned back with a contented sigh. "Keep this forever," she said, tapping the rail, "so we remember where we started." I kept it. I kept everything that held. On Saturdays, when the roof sheathing waited and the sky cooperated, our boy would toddle over the packed earth and lift his arms. Daniel was sturdy then, a knot of warmth and milk breath and insistence. I'd hoist him to my shoulders, his palms patting my temples in a rhythm only he knew. "Hi, Daddy," he'd crow, and I'd parade him past the ladder and the stacks of shingles, careful as a priest with a relic. He liked the hammer's shine. I'd show him how to hold it low on the handle so the weight did the work. He'd mimic the motion, solemn, as if he already understood that tools deserve your respect. There is a kind of love that arrives quietly through the hands, through the boards you carry, the door you plane so it won't stick, the cradle you sand until the grain runs like water under your palm. I worked overtime to buy insulation because winters here are long and loud in the bones. I picked cabinet hinges that wouldn't squeal. I left a tiny nick in the pantry shelf, a private mark that said I was here and I was careful. When we moved in, Linda set her chair by the window. Daniel fell asleep in my lap while the furnace clicked its reassurance from the cellar. I blinked, and the workshop sharpened. A radio huddled in the corner, wheezing AM ball games. The mallet's head showed a bruise where it had missed its mark and hit the bench, my fault, once. Every mistake was a lesson. You learn the grain's argument, the way a knot makes a nail wander. The house taught me how to be patient. You can't rush glue, you clamp and wait. You trust that what you cannot see between surfaces is curing into strength. Memory, like wood, moves with weather. It cups and crowns, it swells, it can split under a sudden change. It can also hold fast if you respected it when you milled it. In that light, in that dust, I can still see Linda's face the night we crossed the threshold with our own key. She touched the door jamb lightly, as if blessing it. "We did this," she whispered. "You did." I shook my head and said what men like me say, "We'll see what leaks." The present wavered at the edges, then cut in like a saw biting. The hospital air was thin and well-behaved. A monitor purred. Under the cast, bone throbbed away as struck joist hums before going quiet. I tried to flex my fingers and felt the boundary the doctor had warned me about. Move, and pain will answer. Stay still, and pain will wait. I had known hours of honest ache, the kind you earn from lifting too much plywood or from running wire through stubborn holes. This was different. It wasn't the tax of labor. It was an insult written at the joint where faith once sat. The workshop came again without my asking. Daniel at 5, learning to sand with the grain. Daniel at 10, bent over a school project we built too well. Daniel at 16, door slamming, a look in his eye like frost hardening on glass. Sometimes a board looks straight until the first cut. Then its hidden warp declares itself, sly as a smile. You learn to work around it, rip it thinner, laminate it against something truer, or you waste it and begin again. But a son is not a board. He is not an object you can plane into square. I saw the chair I'd made for Linda, In the years when the TV moved rooms, when the sofa changed twice, the chair stayed. It took the scuffs in the years. Its arms grew soft with touch. The corner of the seat carried a crescent stain from someone's coffee, probably mine. Once, when money was so tight, I considered selling it. I picked it up, felt the old weight of it, saw the tiny wedge where a tenon shows itself like a shy truth, and put it back by the window. I told myself a house that forgets its first chair forgets its foundation. I didn't know I'd need that lesson again with people. A nurse's shoes whispered past the door. Somewhere down the hall, someone laughed, then apologized for laughing in a place where pain is supposed to own the floor. I breathed slowly, the way the physical therapist had taught me after the knee surgery. Count 4 in, hold 2, count 4 out. It didn't make the pain vanish. It taught my body who was in charge. I let the 70s fade. They did not want to. They liked the light. I brought back the bulb above the garage, flickering, lazy. I brought back the ring of steel on concrete, the cheap, cruel sound that put a bright, ragged seam down the evening. The mind does what it must to survive the present. It goes where dignity lives and borrows a little of it to spend now. But it can't live there all day. Not if you mean to set anything right. I looked at the cast again, at the way it encased the saga of a single moment. All the years inside my hands, houses and cabinets and cribs, lunches packed and screws turned, 1,000 small dignities no one writes down, sat under that stiff white shell like a town under snow. I told myself quietly, because quiet has always been stronger than shouting in my life, that the work those hands had done could not be erased by one night. Wood remembers. So does a man. Blinked Onator ticked off its little green sermon. I lay still, listening to it until the past and present sat side by side on the same bench. Then I let the thought form, simple and unadorned, the way you start a project that matters with a first straight cut. I raised him with these hands. Mr. Hayes is senile. You know he broke his own arm? A whisper drifted down the grocery aisle. It came from behind a wobbling cart of canned soup and coupons, from two faces I knew well enough to nod to in better years. They didn't lower their eyes when I turned. They just let their voices float as if gossip were a kind of public service. I stood beside a pyramid of oranges and felt the bruise under my cast throb to the rhythm of the store's soft music. A month ago, those same mouths had asked about my tomatoes, about the trick for keeping squirrels off the bird feeder. Now they arranged their words around me like caution tape. I kept moving. The floor shone too clean, and the wheels on my cart complained. I told myself to buy bread, eggs, aspirin. Ordinary things hold the world together when the rest of it tries to come apart. At the checkout, the young clerk, freckles, a shy smile, asked, "Paper or plastic?" then glanced down at the cast and flushed. "Sorry." I said it was fine. She bagged gently as if my groceries might hurt if jostled. Behind me, someone murmured, "Such a shame," and meant me, not the fallen price of milk. By Sunday, the rumor had a pew. The church smelled of old hymnals and lemon oil. Winter light ran through the stained glass and pooled in colored lakes on the tile. I sat near the back because my arm ached less when I didn't have to stand and sit with the crowd. Reverend Collins greeted people at the door, palms open, the way a man trying to catch water holds his hands. When he reached me, his smile faltered. "Arthur," he said, "how are you? Managing?" "Getting by." I kept my voice low. It felt wrong to bring noise into that room. He nodded, then lowered his tone, pastoral and careful. "There's talk. Daniel says you've been slipping. We all have our seasons. Perhaps minimize stress while you heal." It was meant as kindness. It landed like a hand gently moving a microphone away from my mouth. I wanted to say, "My son hit me with a shovel." I wanted the sentence to echo against the wooden rafters so the whole town would have to sit with it. But the sanctuary makes people careful with words. It teaches you to wait your turn. So I said, "I'll keep quiet." He patted my shoulder, relieved to hear the answer he could bless. After the service, a few men I used to drink coffee with peeled off to the far side of the hall. They studied a bulletin board so intently you'd think it held the minutes to their lives. One of them, a fishing partner from summers past, picked up a flyer, then set it back down unread. Our eyes almost met. He found an invisible speck on his sleeve and brushed it with great attention. I had not realized how loud absence could be until the people who once filled your hours learned to step around you like furniture. At the diner, the bell over the door chimed in. The waitress May brought coffee without asking, muscle memory stronger than rumor. I wrapped my good hand around the mug and let the heat move into my palm. At the counter, two men bent over their plates the way men bend when they are holding a debate that needs privacy. My name slipped out of one mouth like a seed he wasn't sure would sprout. Hayes. The other man shook his head. You can't trust what he says anymore. It was said with authority, the way you repeat something you heard twice and now own. Daniel had been busy. I could see his work the way a carpenter sees the seams in shoddy cabinetry, the repeated phrases, the convenient ellipses. He fell. He forgot. He's embarrassed. Linda had polished it with her gentle voice. He's been confused, she would say in the frozen foods aisle. Sympathetic, a dutiful wife caring for a man who can't be expected to remember. A lie told in the register of compassion is harder to argue with. It charges you with cruelty for resisting it. Outside, the wind came up with a little edge of sleet, tapping the awning like a typewriter. I pulled my coat closed over the cast and stepped carefully. In the reflection of the diner window, I watched two men stand, check their wallets, and choose the door opposite mine. It looked accidental. It wasn't. On the sidewalk, a woman I'd once helped when her back porch sagged, put on her sunglasses, though the day had no sun. She said, "Cold one?" to the space just left of me. What hurt wasn't that they doubted. Doubt is natural. It grows in the cracks where information is scarce. What hurt was the quickness with which they accepted the lesser story, the one that made their coffee taste the same as yesterday's. If I was the problem, they didn't have to consider that a son could lift steel against a father, or that a wife could turn laughter into a weapon. My pain asked them to rearrange their furniture. Their rumor let them keep their chairs where they were. I walked home past yards where I'd fixed gates for the fun of it. Dog prints stitched patterns in the frost. The cast itched. Every few steps, the eight climbed and settled, like a tide that had misread the moon. Through the kitchen window, our table sat with the bill still on it, a small, plain square of truth no one wanted to touch. Linda was rinsing a cup, movements neat and economical. When she saw me, she tilted her head. "You shouldn't overexert yourself," she said, concern arranged carefully on her face. "It's not good for your condition." "What condition is that?" I asked. "Forgetfulness," she said almost kindly. "We'll manage." Garage door. I stopped. The shovel was gone. The empty hooks were just hooks again. The smell of oil had thinned, replaced by cold and the faint dust of old wood. I set my palm on the scarred bench and felt the groove where a clamp had bit too hard years ago. There are marks the world accepts as history. Scratches, dents, the places where years collect. There are marks it prefers not to see. The second kind writes itself under skin. My phone buzzed. A message from an old friend glowed on the screen. One sentence that tried to be neutral and landed in cowardice. "Thinking of you. Let's catch up later." Later is where people send what they can't bear to carry now. I looked at the word until the letters broke apart. Pedestrians came. I went to the small room off the hall where the light is gentle and the house is quiet. I sat at the desk I'd built from leftover maple and slid open the top drawer. Inside lay a narrow notebook I'd bought on a day I thought I'd use it for measurements. The first page was clean and a little stiff. I uncapped a pen and listened to the heat click in the baseboards. Outside, a car door shut. Somewhere a dog shook its collar. I quietly opened the journal and began to record the truth. The Ring camera by the front door was gone. I noticed it when I came in from the cold, the empty bracket staring at me like a missing tooth. A small circle of clean paint outlined where the device had clung, catching porch light and wind chimes, documenting every package and every step across that threshold. Now there was only silence and the faint shadow of screws pulled hastily from wood. My stomach sank in a way the arm's pain never had. This wasn't accident. This was subtraction. Camouflage smelled of rust and dust. I searched for the camera among the shelves of half-used paint cans and boxes of screws, but the corners offered nothing but cobwebs. In the past, when something went missing, I blamed myself. Old eyes, poor memory, a habit of setting tools down where they didn't belong. But this wasn't a hammer misplaced. Someone had climbed the 2 steps, reached high, and unscrewed a witness from the wall. My phone buzzed, the screen lit with a message under my name, only I hadn't sent it. I fell again, sorry for the confusion. Another followed. Don't believe everything you hear. Both carried my signature, my number, as if my own hands had betrayed me. I scrolled, dread curdling, to find entire strings of words I'd never typed. Apologies, contradictions, fragments of nonsense. Daniel stood in the doorway, arms folded, eyes full of casual fire. "You should be more careful with your phone, Dad," he said. "People might think you've lost track of what you're sending." Linda, from the couch, let out a low chuckle. "He doesn't even remember what he writes anymore, do you, Arthur?" She tapped ash into a tray and smiled as though this were comedy, a sitcom she could enjoy at my expense. Messages like that just appear. You really ought to rest. As standard, I opened my mouth and closed it. The cast weighed on me. My good hand trembled, not from weakness, but from the realization that my voice had been stolen, repurposed, weaponized. I could argue that I hadn't written those words. I could insist, but they would only shake their heads, laugh louder, and present the text to anyone who doubted. The next day, faces in town had already shifted. "Poor Arthur," they said in voices meant for overhearing. "Can't even remember what he tells people?" The false messages had traveled faster than truth ever could. Screenshots don't blush. Digital lies walk straighter than human testimony, and so the gaslight burned brighter, not with kerosene, but with pixels. I sat in the living room that night, the walls breathing their old sighs, the clock muttering each second, and opened the journal I'd begun. My pen scratched against the paper, sharp and deliberate. December, cold, camera missing. Texts sent in my name, but not by me. Daniel nearby, Linda laughing. This is the record. The cast itched. My heart hurt more than my arm. I wrote through it. Each word was weight against their erasure, ballast to keep me steady while the world tilted. I resolved then that memory would not live only in my head, vulnerable to their denial. It would have ink, dates, and the steady hand of a man who refused to disappear. Arthur decided he would write every single day, turning memory itself into evidence. "I once saw him shove you down behind the workshop," Frank whispered. The words cut through the clatter of spoons and the hiss of the espresso machine. The roadside cafe smelled of wet coats and burnt coffee grounds, a refuge for truckers and late shift workers. Rain hammered the wide front windows, breaking the gray daylight into restless rivers. I sat alone at a corner table, cast laid across the edge, notebook open but empty. Then a familiar shadow blocked the light. Take Frank Miller, his hair thinner, his shoulders rounder, but his eyes the same steady blue from 40 years back. We had swung hammers together once, raised trusses in the same July sun. He carried the weather of his years in a brown jacket that smelled faintly of sawdust even in retirement. He slid into the chair across from me. No ceremony, no asking, just presence. He leaned forward so the waitress wouldn't hear. "Arthur, I saw it. Not this time, but before. Behind your shop maybe 2 winters ago. Daniel shoved you hard. I thought you slipped on ice, but I saw his hands." My throat closed around air. I tried to speak, but the cafe sounds muffled, like hearing through insulation. I managed. "Why? Why didn't you say anything?" Frank looked at his coffee, steam fogging his glasses. "I thought it was a family thing. You know how small towns are. A father and son yelling. It isn't my business, I told myself. But then I heard the talk lately. The rumors about you losing your mind, and I knew I'd been a coward." The pen slipped from my fingers. My hand shook, but not from pain, from relief so sharp it bordered on grief. To be seen after months of erasure was like air after drowning. "Frank," I whispered, Thank you. I thought no one believed me anymore. He reached across the table, calloused palm brushing the back of my cast. Don't thank me yet. If this goes to court, I'll stand there. I'll say what I saw. Not just now, before. The shove, the way he looked at you. You weren't confused. You weren't clumsy. He was cruel. The rain pressed harder, drumming steady against the glass. The cafe's chatter blurred into background noise. For the first time since the shovel, I felt a weight lift, not all of it, but enough to straighten my spine. Frank dug into his pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. From it, he slipped a card across the table. White stock, simple black font, Anna Lopez, attorney at law. She's good, he said. Helped my brother with a labor dispute. Knows how to dig for truth, call her. I picked up the card, thumb pressing into the raised ink like it was a lifeline. Frank's voice lowered again. You don't have to fight this alone, Arthur, not anymore. A paper felt warm again, it should have been. In that instant, the night around me didn't seem endless. Frank handed Arthur the business card of attorney Anna Lopez. Reverend Collins laid a hand on my shoulder. Perhaps you should rest, Arthur. Stop stirring up trouble. Unsure, the words landed heavier than the hymn echoing through the rafters. The church was warm, lit by tall windows spilling cold sunlight across polished pews. Incense clung faintly to the air, mixing with the smell of old hymnals, wax, and wool coats. I had come seeking comfort, the familiar cadence of prayer, the steady hum of voices raised together, but comfort withdrew before I even sat down. The choir was singing Amazing Grace, but their eyes slid over me as if I were another cracked tile in the floor. Whispers carried faster than song. Daniel's lies had made their rounds. The forgetful father, the unstable man who tripped and blamed others. Linda had polished the tale, her gentle tones draped in concern. Now it was gospel to half the room. I approached Collins after the service, holding my good arm against the ache of the broken one. I asked quietly if he had a moment. He listened at first, his face open the way ministers are trained to look. But when Daniel appeared at the back of the hall, his story already delivered, Collins's expression shifted. Your son tells me you've been confused, he said, voice carefully neutral. We all have seasons when we must lean on others. I am not confused, I said. The words shook more than I meant them to. I was hurt, Collins raised his hand gently, as if to still a quarrel before it began. Arthur, perhaps rest is best. We don't want to divide the congregation. Divide, the word stung, as though truth itself were a quarrel, and peace was found only in silence. Around us, parishioners gathered coats and purses, but none of them met my eyes. These were men I had built porches for, women whose leaking faucets I had fixed without charge, children I had carved toys for out of scrap wood. Now their gazes brushed past me like wind sliding past a stone. I felt the hollowness of exile even as I stood among them. The cross above the altar glowed with reflected light, and still it felt distant, unreachable. Behind me, Linda's laughter floated soft as silk. She looped her arm through Daniel's, guiding him toward the door like a queen exiting beside her champion. Their heads bent close, sharing a private victory, leaving me anchored in their wake. The choir's final chord faded, leaving only the creak of pews. I lifted my eyes to the crucifix, wood carved by some craftsman who once believed in endurance. My whisper barely left my lips, yet it felt like it filled the nave. If you still hear, Lord, keep the truth alive. The pen scraped across the page. Arthur wrote the date, the hour, every detail. The desk lamp pooled a small, tired light over the maple surface I'd built years ago. Beyond that circle, the room held its breath. The radiator ticking in shy replies. The winter wind fingering the loose sash. The rest of the house, arranged in the stillness of people who prefer their truths unexamined. I steadied the notebook with my good hand and wrote the facts the way a carpenter lays out a board before the cut. Straight edge, clear marks, no flourish. 9:12 p.m. Voices in the hallway. Linda's tone soft, dismissive. Daniel's short, sharp, no apology. The front camera, gone since morning. Screws missing from the bracket. Phone shows messages I did not write. Team, the ink looks smaller than the life it contained. That is the trick of paper. It tames what would otherwise overwhelm. I paused, listened, and added what I heard. The refrigerator cycling on, a television murmuring in the living room, the occasional clink of glass. I wrote those down too. If anyone ever questioned the night, I wanted its texture on record. Not just what was said, but the weather of our home, the currents, the drafts, the way a particular silence can run colder than a January wind. From the hall, Linda's laugh drifted in, not unkind to an outsider's ear, but I knew its edges. "He doesn't even remember what he wrote," she said. Low enough to pass for concern, loud enough to carry. I noted the words as they arrived, without comment, the way you log rainfall. Daniel's reply was a shrug in syllables. He didn't need sentences to bruise. He had the confidence of a man whose version of events had begun to stick. I turned the page and drew a thin line down the center. On the left, time. On the right, event. The method calmed me. It gave the hour a backbone. I filled it the way I used to fill a cut list. Long, short, long, each piece destined to fit another. Prejudice, 9:31 p.m. A thud against the garage door. Maybe the wind, maybe the shovel back on the hooks, scrubbed and hung with new innocence. Nihil, 9:44 p.m. Footsteps past this room. Daniel's stride, heel first, quick. Linda behind, slower, slippered. 10:03 p.m. You need to rest, from Linda through the wood. Reply withheld. I stopped and watched my handwriting. It had grown more careful since the cast, each letter deliberate, as if the words knew they could be asked to testify and wanted to be presentable. My hand ached. I let it ache. Pain is a witness I could trust. What I feared most wasn't that I would forget. It was that the story would be taken from me and retold by those who found it useful. Memory lives in the body first, but bodies are easy to discredit. Paper endures. Even fire only turns it into something legible to the nose, a burned truth. But we are not at fire, we are at ink, at winter, at a desk bathed in lamplight, and I intend to leave a trail. In the margin, I wrote the exact words Daniel had used 2 nights ago when the bill lay on the table. Not the shove, words. The small dismissals, the smirk he wore like a badge, the way Linda corrected my account before I had finished the sentence. This was the part no camera would have captured even if the ring hadn't vanished. The slow abrasion of dignity, the tender places ground down by 1,000 tiny denials. In the house, the volume rose, a show, laughter, a can opening. I dated the line and put it down. I wanted whoever read this to hear what I heard, a home rearranged to make room for what should never be permitted inside it. Page later, I wrote the sentence that had been refusing to sit still in my head. My hands shook. I paused, breathed, and wrote it anyway, each word separate, squared to the line. Daniel lifted the shovel and struck me. I looked at the sentence until the letters blurred into strokes, until the room leaned and righted itself. Behind my ribs, the memory replayed with the exactness of a nail finding its pilot hole. The cold, the quick step back, the shock, the bright metallic ring that had stitched itself into the night. The body doesn't forget impact. The skin holds its ledger. The bone hums with what it has survived. But there is a different power in seeing the truth on a page you can hold. If someone ever tried to hand me back a different past, I would hand this to them, and to anyone who mattered. I closed my eyes and heard the house make the smallest of sounds, the ones you only notice when you are listening, as if your life depends on it. The duck gave a polite click. The floorboard just outside the doorway, the one with a hint of give from years of passage, offered a soft complaint. I rose, slid the notebook into a snug sleeve I'd hollowed out years ago beneath the bottom drawer, my old habit of building a hiding place for nothing in particular finally finding its purpose, and settled the drawer back so it kissed the frame. Then I opened the notebook again. Hiding it would not keep it safe from time. Only filling it could do that. I added more lines, the exact wording of a text that had gone out under my number, the name on the attorney's card Frank had given me, the model of the camera that no longer watched the door. Each fact was a stud in a wall. Alone, a stick. Together, a frame. I wrote until the lamp's light thinned at its edges. The house quieted around me, like a pond smoothing after a thrown stone. I capped the pen, let it rest between my fingers, and breathe carefully through the ache that had been my companion since the garage.
Taking the hallway aboard Crete, not because wood is treacherous, but because it tells the truth about weight and motion. The shadows shifted under the door. I could make out the slope of a shoulder, the hesitation of someone counting his choices. The air cooled by a degree I felt in the bones that weren't broken. My pulse stepped up, an old drummer finding a quicker tempo. Outside the door, Daniel's footsteps stopped, as if he were about to discover it. Dr. Patel's brow creased as he replayed the intake file. "Shut up!" rang clear. In a small office off the emergency department, a square of neutral paint and humming hardware. A monitor glowed on the desk beside a stack of charts. Blinds cut the afternoon light into even bars. The nurse who'd wrapped my arm stood with her hands tucked into her pockets, eyes fixed on the waveforms skating across the screen. Out of the speakers came the scrape of a gurney wheel, the squeak of my shoes on tile, my breath, ragged, shallow, and then that voice, sharp as the edge of a shovel. "Shut up!" Unset, no one spoke. Patel clicked back a few seconds and let it play again. He adjusted the volume not to heighten the drama, but the way a careful man turns a dial until the static falls away. The sound landed in my chest like a truth I'd been carrying without proof. Under it, faint but unmistakable, was the metallic clatter I remembered, the blade striking concrete in the garage before the ride, a ring that had followed me to this room, like a witness with perfect memory. "The system records intake automatically," the nurse said softly, as if she needed to justify the existence of the file, even to herself. "For quality, for training, sometimes it catches more than vitals." That taking his eyes off the screen, he checked the timestamp, verified the room number, and scrolled the log as if building a chain where each link had to hold. "This is from the triage bay where we first evaluated you," he said to me, measured, calm. "That voice, do you recognize it?" Unsafe, I didn't trust my throat. I just nodded once. The room seemed to tilt and then right itself. My hands shook on the arm of the chair in a rhythm I couldn't hide. He rewound the clip another time, and I forced myself to listen all the way through. My winded answers, Linda's smooth intervention. He slipped, he exaggerates, and then the command that had split the night. Hearing it here pinned to a record that didn't belong to our house made the past hour feel less like a bad dream and more like a line carved into wood. Patel minimized the audio and pulled up the x-rays. Bone bloomed in grayscale on the screen, a clean fracture bright as chalk. He traced the break with a capped pen, not touching the glass. "This pattern is consistent with a focused blow," he said. "A fall typically presents differently. The soft tissue swelling corroborates a recent impact." The words were clinical, but they carried weight. Evidence doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't need to. He clicked into my chart, reading what had already been written. "Accidental fall reported by spouse," and then typed a new paragraph below it. I watched his shoulders as if I could read the sentences through the movement of muscle and cloth. He asked the nurse to note the file's location, to tag it so it couldn't vanish into the long hallway where data goes to be forgotten. She did, quick and precise, as though speed itself were a kind of protection. "I should have found this yesterday," Patel said, not with guilt, but with the sober frustration of a man who dislikes being a step behind the truth. "We listen to intake when something feels off." It did. "It always feels off," I said, and surprised myself by saying it out loud. The room did not flinch. "In my house," I added, quieter, "lately." He turned from the screen and looked at me the way a good carpenter looks at a bubble in a level. Steady, verifying, unwilling to pretend. "I believe you," he said, simple as that. "And we have more than belief now." Parachute slid a tissue box toward me with the kind of kindness that doesn't call attention to itself. I didn't take one. The relief wasn't tears exactly, it was air. My lungs felt like rooms in a house I hadn't entered in months, suddenly open to light. "May I hear it once more?" I asked, not because I enjoy pain, but because something in me needed to set the sound in place the way you seat a joint, firm and final. Patel obliged. The voice came again, his voice, and the ring, and my own breath stumbling. When it ended, the hum of the fluorescent light returned, a small mechanical mercy. "This recording will matter," Patel said. "Along with the imaging, your statement,
and any other witnesses. I'm obligated to document my findings thoroughly. Elder abuse is reportable. That process is already moving. A report, a trail that didn't rely on my memory or anyone's patience with it. I thought of the notebook in my desk, the lines I'd written under the lamp's thin gold, and felt the two records, paper and digital, reach for each other like hands across a gap. The nurse stepped out to print forms. We sat with the quiet for a moment, the calm after a storm that hasn't yet reached the next town. Patel rotated the screen away, a gesture that gave me back a little privacy, and folded his hands. People will say I'm confused, I said. They already are. Disillusioned, say it, he replied. This, he tapped the desk, meaning the record, the image, the time-stamped breath, does not confuse. Leaned forward, my voice surprised me by holding steady. This is the truth they can't deny. Punished, Patel nodded. I will testify that I want to file a complaint against my son, my voice trembling but firm. The duty officer looked up from a wooden desk, scarred by years of elbows in ink. Behind him, a printer clicked inside, spitting out forms with boxes that wanted neat answers. Ana Lopez stood at my side, hands folded over a slim legal pad, her posture steady in a room that smelled of paper dust and stale coffee. She let me speak first, then filled in the lines I missed. Dates, times, the words he used, the shovel, the x-ray, the hospital intake audio. The medical imaging and the recording, she told the officer, her tone even. Requesting a case number today and referral to the elder abuse unit. Nodded, typed, and a cursor blinked as if keeping time with my pulse. You'll sign here, sir. Statement under penalty of perjury. He slid the form across. My good hand was slow but sure. I wrote each letter like it mattered, because it did. When I finished, he stamped the corner, a dull thud that felt more final than any word we'd said. Ana walked me through the next steps. Protective order, she said, touching the top page. We'll ask for temporary relief first. No contact, no proximity to your home, no messages through third parties. You'll carry a copy. The police will have one on file. Push back, I asked. They will, she said, not unkindly. Expect it. Don't argue with them directly. Call me, call the police, let the paper speak. Protections returned with a yellow carbon copy and a number to lace to memory. Your report is filed. You'll be contacted by a detective. If the respondent tries to contact you, dial 911. I didn't know I'd been holding eased out of me. It wasn't peace exactly. It was structure, steps on a staircase instead of a cliff. Ana gathered the documents and slipped them into a folder. One more thing, she said. Change your phone passcode. 2-factor where you can. We'll talk about preserving your journal and backing it up off-site. Outside, the afternoon was thin and gray, the lot a scatter of salt and old snow. I took 2 careful breaths and felt my shoulders settle. Then I saw him. Across the rows of cars, Daniel stood by a dented sedan, collar up, hands shoved deep in his pockets. He watched me the way a dog watches a gate, calculating angles, waiting for a weakness. Our eyes met. His mouth tightened, then flicked into something like a smile and back again. In the reflection on his windshield, I could see my own cast, bright as a warning flag. Ana touched my elbow. Keep walking, she murmured. We're done here. We reached her car. I gripped the door frame, steadying against a tug of pain. The world held for a heartbeat, ordinary in its noises, engines, a distant siren, the slap of a flag against a pole. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a hard little rattle against my ribs. I pulled it out. No name, no number, just a gray bubble on the screen, and 8 blunt letters that stripped the air from my chest. Regret it. He imagined it all, the witness declared from the stand. The Lucas County courtroom was packed, every bench filled with neighbors, churchgoers, curious onlookers drawn by gossip. The air was stale with heat and perfume, bodies pressed close beneath high ceilings. I sat at the defense table beside Ana Lopez, my cast propped against the polished wood, heart pounding so loudly I feared the judge could hear it. The aisle, his suit too new, his smirk too practiced. Beside him, Linda dabbed at her eyes with a folded tissue, the picture of weary devotion. Between them sat their allies, men I barely knew, one of whom now swore under oath that he'd watched me stumble over a cord in the garage and fall. The words slid through the room like oil. The prosecutor's pen paused. Even the judge leaned forward. I tried to breathe, but the walls seemed to close in, and the truth shrank inside me until it felt like a flickering candle about to be snuffed. Linda followed, her voice low, tremulous. Arthur's been struggling. He forgets things. He thinks people are against him. I love my husband, but he isn't himself anymore. The performance drew sympathetic murmurs from the gallery. She squeezed Daniel's arm when she returned to her seat, their unity on display like a medal. Each false word cut deeper than the break in my bone. I watched the prosecutor's shoulders shift, uncertain, as though weighing whether this case had any foundation left. My pulse quickened. It was happening again. The burial of truth under the weight of lies. The same pattern I had lived in my own home, now playing out on public record. I bowed my head, despair pressing heavy. Maybe it will always be their word against mine. Maybe the world prefers their tidy fiction to my fractured truth. Then a chair scraped. Anna rose, her navy suit crisp, her voice ringing with quiet steel. "Your Honor," she said, turning toward the bench, "we have another piece of evidence to submit." The room hushed. My breath caught. For the first time that day, hope cracked the silence. "Shut up!" Daniel's voice boomed through the courtroom speakers. Silence followed like a dropped curtain. You could hear the wires hum, the bench creak under the stenographer's shifting weight. The sound filled the high room, then kept on living in it as if it had always been part of the old wooden plaster. I felt it land in my ribs exactly where the pain still remembered its address. Physician Patel stood a step from the projector cart, calm as a man measuring twice before cutting. "This is the triage intake recording from the night Mr. Hayes presented," he said evenly, time-stamped and archived by hospital protocol. "You also heard the metallic impact immediately preceding the command." On the screen, the waveform curled like a small coastline. The prosecutor nodded for him to continue. He clicked to the next image, my X-ray, washed in gray light. The fracture was a clean white slash, bright as chalk on slate. "This pattern," Patel said, tracing near the break without touching the glass, "is consistent with a focused blow from a hard object. A fall typically produces a different morphology. Diffuse trauma, different angles. The associated soft tissue swelling corroborates an acute impact." His voice never rose, it didn't need to. Daniel stared at the table, jaw set. Linda's fingers tightened on her handkerchief until the lace collapsed. The gallery rustled in a slow wave. Neighbors, parishioners, men I'd framed roofs with once upon a summer, whispering to themselves as if the truth required their permission to exist. "Tack," the prosecutor asked, "in your professional opinion, is an accidental fall a plausible cause?" Patel met the question head-on. "No, not given the imaging, the intake recording, and the patient's presentation. It is not consistent with a self-inflicted or accidental mechanism." My lungs remembered how to work. I wasn't lightheaded, I was lighter. I thought of my notebook at home, every date and hour written in careful lines, and felt the distance between paper and proof close like a well-fit joint. Linda's color drained as the audio played again. My staggered breath, her polished interruption, then that barked order with its edge of steel. Daniel flushed, then looked up, eyes hot, as if glare could sand down evidence. The judge watched without blinking, hands tented, gaze moving from the screen to Daniel, to me, back to Patel. "Any cross?" the judge asked. Daniel's attorney rose, adjusted his tie, and tried a different road. "Doctor, isn't it true that older patients often misremember? That stress can contaminate recollection?" "Memory is a human variable," Patel said. "Imaging is not. A recording is not." A thin, astonished murmur ran the room. Even the prosecutor seemed taller. I caught his eye, he gave the smallest nod. We are on solid ground now. For months I had been an island of one. In that moment I felt a bridge lay itself down, plank by plank. The attorney sat. The prosecutor rested his hand on the cart as if it were a lectern and said, "No further questions." He didn't need to add anything. The room had already heard what mattered. I glanced at Daniel. For a heartbeat, the boy who once rode my shoulders flickered behind the man he had become, then was gone. Linda stared at the screen as if it had betrayed her personally. The air sharpened, expectant. The judge leaned forward, lifted the mallet, and brought it down once, the sound neat and final.
The judge rapped the gavel. We will deliberate. Defendant Daniel Hayes is guilty of elder abuse. The words fell into the late afternoon hush like a stone into still water, ripples moving through every bench. The judge's voice did not rise, it didn't have to. He stacked the sentences with the same deliberate care a carpenter lays boards. Probation with strict conditions, mandatory counseling, restitution for medical costs, and a no-contact order that would keep Daniel far from my door, my phone, my life. The clerk recorded each measure. The gavel rested at the judge's elbow like a small, patient hammer. Qualification the aisle. Daniel stared at a fixed point on the floor, jaw locked. Linda's hand trembled around a tissue that had long since given up pretending to be clean. When the court turned to her, the judge's words were cooler. The record would reflect her enabling, her attempts to mislead. While she wasn't before him as a defendant, her credibility in this room, and outside it, was gone. A few in the gallery shifted, as if a picture on a familiar wall had finally been corrected. Anna's fingers touched my sleeve, a brief anchor. Protective order stands, she whispered. You walk out of here with paper and the law behind it. I nodded, feeling the weight I'd carried for months lift by degrees I could actually count. Breath moved all the way to the bottom of my lungs. My cast itched. For once it was an ordinary annoyance. Mr. Hayes, the judge added, looking directly at me. The court recognizes you as the victim in this case. If there are further violations, you contact law enforcement immediately. Recognition. One simple word, yet it set a beam where none had held. For a moment, I lowered my head, and the tears ran without shame. Then I straightened. The room was the same, old wood, brass, murmurs, but the angle of it had changed. I had ground under my feet again. As the bailiff called the next case, the crowd began to unstick. Shoes scraped, whispers started. Daniel rose stiffly. Linda turned to me, her eyes tight as knotted rope, and leaned just close enough that only I could hear. For this, is Daniel really convicted? The whisper rode the market's cold air. I heard it by the apples, followed by the soft slap of newspapers being folded under arms. The headline had run that morning. No names at first, then a midday update that spared none. At the butcher counter, two men who used to ask me about fence posts now kept their questions for the ground. Their silence moved aisle to aisle, a tide that did not want to admit it had turned. By noon, the coffee shop was a low thrum of carefully measured voices. Screens lit with the same article. Thumbs scrolled, paused, scrolled again, as if the verdict might change on a second reading. Probation, counseling, no contact, someone recited. The way you read a weather report that finally predicts sun after months of gray. Chairs scraped when I walked in. Not to flee, just a rearranging, a new geometry. May slid a mug toward me without a word. The old kindness restored. I wrapped my hand around the heat and let the room recalibrate. Submerged didn't appear. His friends did, thinner now by 2 or 3 at a time. One tried to meet my eye, then abandoned the attempt and left a tip too large. Pen hovering over a guilt he couldn't sign away. Outside, I passed a pickup idling by the curb. The driver stared through me until recognition found him, and he looked down as if he had glanced at the sun. At church, no one said Linda's name aloud. She sat alone near the back, the silk of her scarf louder than any hymn. When she stood to leave, Rose parted the way people make room for a procession they don't want to join. She adjusted her coat with practiced dignity, but her gaze searched for shelter and found none. Newsprint smudged my fingers. It felt like honest dirt after a long season of ash. On Maple Street, a woman whose porch I'd once repaired crossed over, breath making small clouds. Arthur, she said, voice careful, I believe you from the start. The sentence was a plank laid between two banks. I stepped onto it and felt it hold. Afternoon thinned into a pale blue evening. I was packing groceries at my kitchen table, bread, a sack of potatoes, the week's ordinary salvation, when there came a knock. 3 measured taps that belonged to a man who knows how to wait. I opened the door. Reverend Collins stood on the stoop, hat in hand, winter at his back, contrition on his face. He cleared his throat and his eyes met mine. I owe you an apology. Model, please listen as Arthur Hayes tells his own story, Reverend Collins said. The church hall was full, the kind of full that warms the windows and fogs the glass. Folding chairs lined the walls. The old piano sat quiet, lid down like a respectful hand. I stood at the lectern with my cast-free arm resting on the wood I'd planed smooth back when this building was a project and not a refuge. Frank was in the third row, cap in his lap. Anna leaned against the side wall with a legal pad she didn't need tonight. The room had the rustle of coats, the tin scent of radiator heat, and the hush of people who have come to hear something that might change what they think they know. And nearly my throat, Ruli began. Not with the verdict, but with the sound of steel in a garage on a winter night. I told them about the bill on the table, about asking a grown son to contribute, about the way a simple request can turn sharp when pride is hungry. I told them the ring of metal on concrete, the order bark from a mouth I had once taught to say please. I did not raise my voice. I let each sentence settle, the way you set a nail and then tap again to seat it. I spoke of the hospital's bright rectangle of light, of Linda's careful laugh, of being called confused so often that the word tried to take root in me. I described the days when faces turned away at the market, the Sundays when pews parted not out of respect but avoidance. Then I told them what turned it: a doctor who listened twice, a recording that didn't forget, an x-ray that could not be argued with, and a man named Frank who remembered what he had seen and found the courage to say it. I did not hide my shame or my anger. I set them down like tools and showed how they'd been used. Truth doesn't die, I said. It waits for the day it can stand up. I told them about paper and ink, dates and times, how a journal can be a small, stubborn lantern. I told them the law can be slow but solid when you keep knocking. I told them that love does not require silence, and that forgiveness, if it ever comes, cannot be built on a lie. For a breath or two, no one moved. The room held still as a photo, then hands met. One pair, then another, until the sound rolled forward and back like surf against a pier. I saw heads bow, not in pity but in simple regard. Reverend Collins's eyes shone. Frank wiped at his nose with the back of his hand and grinned at me like we'd just set a beam true. I stepped back from the lectern and the noise faded to a gentle murmur, the way a job site quiets when the last board slips into place. My heart felt unarmored and strong. This was not triumph. I don't think I'm built for that. It was steadiness, a floor under my feet I had earned one careful, painful plank at a time. Razier rose near the aisle, hands trembling around a folded paper. The crowd turned as the person made their way to the front, breath catching on the microphone stand. Another person stepped to the microphone. I was abused by my own son, too. The rasp of a saw echoed in the small apartment, steady and unhurried. Pedestrians poured through the east-facing window, catching the dust motes that danced with each pull of the blade. My hands, scarred, stiffer than they once were, guided the cut with patience instead of speed. The scent of raw pine filled the room, sharper than coffee, cleaner than any medicine. It had been years since I'd built something from start to finish, but the rhythm of the craft returned as if it had been waiting in my bones all along. On the floor lay the pieces, 2 legs already sanded, a backrest smoothed to curve with the spine. I paused, flexed my fingers, then reached for the plane. Its iron edge kissed the wood, peeling curls that fell like ribbons at my feet. Each stroke whispered a memory, porches I'd framed, beams I'd set, the small crib I once built for Daniel. I let the thoughts come, then pass. The wood in front of me asked for my full attention, and for once, I gave it without shadow. By midday, the chair stood upright, modest and solid. I tightened the last dowel, pressed the joint until it fit snug, and sat back to admire. It wasn't ornate, not the kind you display in windows or polish for show. It was a chair to hold a man steady, plain lines strong enough to weather years. I dragged it toward the doorway, set it square on the threshold, and lowered myself carefully into it. The seat held, the wood creaked just once, then settled. I leaned back, the sun warm on my chest, and let a long breath escape. Muscles still ached, the scars were still mine, but the chair did not splinter, and neither had I. A tired smile bent my mouth, not of triumph, but of peace. Take across the street, life went on. A mail carrier slinging envelopes, a dog tugging its owner toward the park, the hum of an engine at a stoplight.
I watched it all without fear of interruption, without waiting for footsteps behind me. The street belonged to itself. My time belonged to me. Then, light as a bird call, came the voice of a child. A girl from 2 doors down skipped past, her hair catching the breeze. She pointed, eyes bright. "Your chair is beautiful, mister," she called, then darted on, leaving the words hanging in the spring air like a blessing. I looked down at the chair beneath me, at the hands that had built it, at the quiet morning that finally asked for nothing. The chair does not break, I thought, and neither do I.